What is up, you savages? This is the Protect Your Neck podcast, and I'm your host, Dan Tom, analyst whose work you could find over at MMAJunkie.com. But on this here program, we break down high-level MMA, I should say, as I stumble, but in a different way because, well, we're kind of back to normal with the schedule, but with the schedule being fast for all organizations now, it's always good to kind of look back, appreciate where we are, and look back at the action that perhaps took place from a different time. To help me with that, of course, I need a co-host. I'm surprised I haven't had this co-host with me. He's been kind enough to have me on his podcast, which is the MMA Roadshow. I suggest you check out, whether it's on Apple Podcasts or Patreon. That, of course, is MMA Junkie John. What's up, John Morgan?
I'm just happy I finally made the cut, man. I've been building myself up, to be on your show, and I understand, man. I've been scratching and clawing my way to the guest list, and finally I'm here. I've arrived, and it's a special day for me, man. It's a special day.
It's very funny how, hopefully people are picking up on the comedy here because, of course, I've known John for a while. We've crossed paths many a times before in this mixed martial arts scene, especially in the time period we're about to talk about before we actually worked together. But, of course, it's been an honor to be on your show, John, and, just as a listener, and I'm like, wow, I'm actually on John's podcast, and now you fast forward from that even, I'm like, I still haven't had the guy on my podcast, and I work with him. I feel like a jerk over here, so, and you're a wealth of knowledge, so I'm excited to have you on for this topic in particular, which we haven't said off the top if you haven't read the show notes. Top 5 Strikeforce fights. Strikeforce, John.
It's awesome, man. Like you said, looking back, man, I enjoy it too, man. I'm a fight pass aficionado, man. I love going back and watching old tape. I mean, my really fandom for MMA kind of started with the Pancras days, even more so than UFC, man. I mean, watching those old tapes from Japan, I just absolutely loved it. So, yeah, man, going back and, seeing evolutions. I mean, from your perspective, I know, man, you obviously are really into technique breakdown and tactical awareness and analysis and those sort of things. And I think going back and watching the lessons and seeing the development, it's fun. But even just knowing the history of the sport and seeing how it evolves, it's important. And Strikeforce was a great organization, man. It really was. Started out as a regional thing. I mean, it was really just, California based. And then, of course, they ended up taking it around the nation and challenging, man. That's so hard to do what they do. And man, they did it with a skeleton crew, dude. They did not have the power of the UFC staff. So put on some great shows. I did always like to joke, I thought that, had you as a bettor or as an analyst just pick the blue corner every single time, you know what I mean? You probably struggle there, but it's. I thought there were a lot of matchups and kind of squash matches, so to speak, where you could look at a card and go, "Hey, I know who's going to win on this fight card." You did, but at the same time, it was fun, man. There were a lot of personalities, a lot of names, and we're going to talk about them here for sure. But a good organization, man, that ended up being, I guess, on the Zuffa tombstone under their roster. But it was a fun time, man.
And we're definitely going to talk about those notes as we, a lot of these, as you guys know, in these top 5 shows, for example, we had a lot of popularity with certain topics. Like, for example, we did a WEC show, John. Of course, we had another fellow friend, colleague, another member of your own MMA Roadshow, if you will, Simon Head, as well on. James Lynch was on to help do some Bellator fights. And a lot of times when we do these kind of historical retrospectives, I just want to kind of lay a little bit of primer before we dive into the list. So, John, of course, feel free to add on, interrupt, interject as you will, because you mentioned a lot of great notes there. But essentially, Strikeforce starts in a really good year, 1985, when this guy was born. And its date of death is the tombstone, which I'm sure we'll touch on too, was 2013, right? And in such time, I'm sure me and you, in all different sorts of ways, our martial arts fandom grew as we watched this organization through different iterations. Obviously, we're more familiar with the MMA iteration. It started off as a kickboxing iteration, of course. Scott Coker coming from traditional martial arts, perhaps is part and parcel with him being part Korean, but he was a Taekwondo guy, which I can respect. Of course, as we saw in the late 80s and 90s, folks, from the PKA kickboxing days, even from the 70s, we start seeing that crossover for traditional martial arts meet with kickboxing and Muay Thai. And there's almost a mixed martial arts kind of scene happening within the stand-up realm, and that's kind of what Strikeforce and Scott Coker himself kind of comes from, right? It gets purchased, of course, by Zuffa in 2011, but before that, a lot of interesting things happened from, the NBC contract in 2008 to them, doing co-promotion, something that's talked about today. Again, Scott Coker was one of the, I don't know if you want to say one of the first, but as far as on that level of MMA, he was definitely on the forefront. Pro Elite, Elite XC, eventually buying out them in 2009. And of course, with those contracts, you got guys like, the Diaz's of the world who, was fighting over in Elite XC. You got to see, perhaps fights, and trilogies with his name. I don't want to burn anything that's going to be on our list, perhaps, John. But you start seeing trilogies and storylines carry over almost seamlessly, which is why if you go on Fight Pass, folks, you might notice both Elite XC and Strikeforce on the same mats for a lot of these fights in certain time periods. Of course, 2009 is kind of an interesting divider too as well, John, because you've got things like people didn't realize elbows were always allowed standing up, but they weren't allowed on the ground. Those weren't integrated, I believe, until Zuffa purchases it. But here's something that I came up on my research. I think they're kind of wrong on this, John. Tell me what you think. I remember weight classes, especially in Japan, or Elite XC of lightweight being 160. But according to Wikipedia, Strikeforce's weight classes prior to 2009 had bantamweight at 130 pounds, featherweight at 145, which is the same, lightweight at 160, welterweight at 175, middleweight at 190. Light heavyweight is the same at 205 pounds, while heavyweight, it just simply says unlimited. Does this sound familiar to you, John?
That's funny, man. I hadn't thought about that in a long time. I remember the Elite XC weight classes definitely stood out to me because it seemed such a market change. But, I guess maybe part of that is maybe, and I don't mean to defame Strikeforce in any way, but their world titles weren't necessarily like, I don't want to say not respected, but it wasn't viewed as like a world championship, so to speak. So it might have been. I mean, I do remember them certainly taking some liberties with where they booked weight classes and that sort of thing. But I don't remember that. I'll have to go back and look at that. That's not standing out to me. But, Jesus, man, I mean, time is flying, and I'm getting old, and this brain is getting not as sharp as it once was.
Well, I mean, hey, I'm cheating here. I got notes. I have to go look half this stuff up to remind myself, John. I'm not fronting. And perhaps that's, I don't know if it's age for me or more getting hit in the head, but neither here nor there. Strikeforce did a lot of interesting things. They also had something called the Challenger shows. They put on about 20 of those, and the Challenger shows, the worst part is when you can't read your own handwriting, but the more important part is the Challenger shows brought us names early as Miesha Tate to later names like Ronda Rousey, who I remember being present for that Challenger show right here in Las Vegas, where she fought Sarah D'Alio. You also had names like Ovince St. Preux, or even other names like, Ryan Couture trying to make his way up, which spawned other names like Matt Ricehouse. And you got from hardcore to more well-known, Challenger Series was kind of a quiet piece for them.
It really was, and I want to say, I mean, I may be wrong here, but Luke Rockhold, Daniel Cormier, They both came through the Challenger Series as well, which kind of takes me back to something kind of funny with them, and kind of talking about the shoestring budget that they were using. If you go through the Fight Pass archives, there's some early fights from some of those guys under the Strikeforce banner that don't exist because they didn't have enough money to pay the crew to tape the entire show. So there would be dark fights, basically, that they weren't even filming. So, you got fights from, like, Luke Rockhold, Daniel Cormier that don't exist. There's no tape on it because nobody was shooting it. Or there's a couple, I think, that as you go through the archive that, like, they had an overhead camera, and they just turned on, like, that overhead camera and left it running, and that's all the footage that exists of it. So it's kind of funny when you talk about it. I mean, they were doing the best they could, trying to keep the budget tight, but it was crazy. The camera crews would come, set up, and then they'd take a break and then go have lunch or whatever while these fights are going on. And so because of that, some of that footage of some of these big stars just doesn't exist.
I love that you mentioned that too, John, because to your point, it's not so much taking a shot on Strikeforce at all or their importance, but you saw that a lot, even fights where there was a main card per se. And, if it was on the prelims, you would get, like, fighters like Chris Cyborg that are, like, big names. But you would get her versus, I believe it was Yokohama, her name was, one of the few southpaws she faced. And you get this, like, kind of overhead cam, like you said. And it's kind of dizzy because you'll actually, the camera, if you go to Fight Pass, it'll follow the cameraman walk into his post. And then he'll jump up on there, and he'll start recording the fight. But once the fight's going, you almost get this, you don't get commentary, so it's weird. But you get this really raw feel for the fight. You get to watch some really high-level fighters. In retrospect, you're like, how is this not getting covered? It just didn't make the coverage portion of the broadcast, to your point, and there are some gems on there.
unrelated to Strikeforce, but this just cracks me up. But I'm going to put this out pretty soon. But there's a Victory FC event where the only footage is like the master tape of one single cameraman shot, and so in between, like as fighters are walking out, he's literally focusing on the breasts of women around the cage, and it's zooming in on their breasts and then zooming out. I'm like, this is the greatest footage I've ever seen. And like, thankfully I'm just doing deep dives and found that. I'm like, this is absolutely hilarious. This dude just got busted perv with his camera in between fights. So to be clear, that was not Strikeforce, but it's pretty damn funny. It's on Fight Pass.
It was a different standard. It was a different time, right, John? It was a different standard in those days. But yeah, I mean, and speaking of women, and before we push on here, there was things like the Playboy Mansion card. That was a fun dive. I got to like play Who's Who. I'm like, oh, I spy Dan Stupp. I spy Josh Gross. That, you know, like I went back to watch that card. That was a trip. You remember that one, John?
Absolutely, yeah. I got to go to the second one, I believe, if I remember right. I think Dan Stupp, of course, the starter, the man that originated MMA Junkie, he went to both of them, if I remember right. But yeah, got to go to the Playboy Mansion and do a card there. I mean, that was a wild one, to say the least, man. Not something that I thought I'd be able to scratch off the bucket list, but pretty cool that they did that.
Definitely, they did a lot of cool things from pageantry, from maybe the more Asian influence to co-promotion, more of the business forefront. Different types of star building, women, which I'm sure we'll talk about. Like all these different check boxes, Strikeforce really checked them all. You still had a very North American, American-friendly product from the sponsorship kind of NASCAR era of our sport. You still had that. Like Strikeforce really did check out all the boxes, tournaments, Grand Prix. I mean, there kind of isn't anything that organization didn't do before we push on, huh, John?
No, Scott Coker, listen, I think sometimes probably people don't realize how deep his roots go. He's not just a businessman, as you kind of alluded to. He's not just like a guy that saw an opportunity and wanted to jump into business. I mean, martial arts is really in his blood, and it goes back to the early days of K1 and obviously he's got ties to the Japanese community and the Japanese scene, and he's taken nods from them, so he's always been willing to do some different things. I think the only criticisms I've ever really heard of Scott as the promoter that was sometimes they overpaid talent, and that may have led to their demise, but they really had no choice. I mean, if they wanted to get big names away from the UFC, they had to pay premium rates, and so that made it difficult for them sometimes, I think, financially. But as far as you talk to people that deal with Scott Coker, man, you'll never meet a more professional guy, a better dude. I mean, I've yet to find somebody that has something bad to say about having a business relationship with Scott Coker, and he understands the sport. You know what I mean? And the other thing I think Scott was always really good about too was not trying to battle with the UFC. He wasn't one of those promoters that said, we're coming after them, we're going to be the world's biggest promoter, we're going to do this, and obviously that's hard, man, to go after the UFC. It doesn't mean it's never worked for anybody. You know what I mean? And once you're on the UFC's radar, if anything, they want to crush you at that point. So I thought he was always really good about just saying, hey, when you would bring it up, he would kind of deflect it. No, we're not worried about them. We've got to worry about our roster and what we're doing and all those things. And I thought he was always really good about that. So, yeah, Scott did a lot of great things and instituted a lot of great, policies and tried out new things. He's a great fight promoter and a great guy, man.
I agree. Well said. And I'll add you back here. Getting a little bit of visual, but the audio's coming through fine. So I'm going to go ahead and keep pushing through here. But no, and everything good on your end, John?
Yeah, it looks okay. Sounds okay on my end. So sorry if it's. I think something. My Wi-Fi's been acting a little screwy today, man. I mean, I have like the fucking Giga Blast from Cox or whatever, but I think it's been kind of a little off today. But so I apologize for that.
Same here. It's all good. We'll see how it records. Maybe this is just on my end because all my other screens are fine, and this isn't a professional show, so I don't mind saying this and can edit it out, which I probably won't. But on those notes about Scott Coker, that was really well said, and yeah, and a lot of the things that you could even people would criticize as far as his methodology on tagging something kind of juicy, headline worthy, bringing back older names, if you will, but then also having real talent. showcased underneath it really cleverly, and that's something that he didn't just do in Bellator, folks. I mean, going back as we kick into our top 5 here, Strikeforce's first show, at least MMA event, is Shamrock versus Gracie. Now, it's not the Shamrock versus Gracie you might expect. It might not be the Gracie you might expect to pick up the torch for the rivalry. No disrespect to Caesar, but it really was a tribute to not just the business model that Coker, which would be successful, he would use for Strikeforce, Bellator, and so on, but really it just housed, which we're going to talk about here, folks. We are going to get to it. That whole NorCal scene. I mean, that NorCal scene, people that don't know, for mixed martial arts, it was a melting pot. You got not just Caesar Gracie, but you got the aggressive Half Gracie, who was alive and thriving then, helped bringing up guys like Dave Camarillo, who of course would attribute to AKA or BJ Penn, who people don't know fought for AKA and trained under the Gracies. He had a lot of NorCal roots there as well. And then you see the Scrap Pack form, right? Nate Diaz, AKA has so many branches and lineages to it. And we'll talk about it all here, but that's kind of what Strikeforce was to me. At the heart of it was a lot of that NorCal scene, man.
No question. I mean, they own the market. I mean, that's their home market. That's where Scott lives, right? And I mean, again, as it started out as just kind of a local promotion. They were doing shows there, but they were the first one to do pro MMA in California. And as you said, man, they had an amazing event there and some amazing names. And yeah, it's funny how Strikeforce probably really benefited from the glut of talent that was in that NorCal area. A chance to fight for a respected promoter and do it in your backyard. I mean, it shuffled a lot of talent straight to them for sure. That AKA pipeline was strong just in and of itself. So, yeah, man, they dominated that market. It really just goes to show you how much talent was coming out of there at that time.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, on that note, let's get to our top 5, shall we? All right, and on that note of being the top 5, I usually offer the guests to kind of go first, starting from 5 to 1. Of course, we will pass the ball. John, you comfortable with your number 5? You want to start this party and let me know what ended up making the cut here at the top of the list?
All right, let's do it. Number 5 for me is going to be something you kind of touched on earlier, that co-promotion angle, man. Frank Shamrock versus Phil Baroni, 2007. It was the combination of Strikeforce and Elite XC. And I love the fight. To me, in thinking back right away, this one stuck out to me. And the fight itself is fantastic because you got two real characters. Frank Shamrock, obviously, a former UFC champion, should be in the UFC Hall of Fame, but he's not. But always an outspoken guy. Certainly doesn't mind carrying himself with a little air of confidence, maybe even a touch of cockiness, we'll say. And then you got Phil Baroni, the New York badass. Come on, dude, what a showman he is, and how many fun fights has he had. And their fight was fantastic. It was back and forth. Frank tells him at one point, gives him a little you're going to sleep thing, puts his hands up to his head, and then drops him right after. Phil Baroni, probably not going to shock you. He ends up gassing out a little bit. The gas tank was always a little bit of an issue with Phil Baroni, and so Frank ends up getting the win. But it's an entertaining fight, and it was back and forth in the beginning. Phil had some moments. So that part was great. But I think to me, it just that card stood out to me. If you go back and watch that card, every fight on the main card was a finish. It was very entertaining. You had some great names on there. Ninja Hu was on there, old school Joey Villasenor, Kung Lee on there against Tony Franklin, Paul Buentello against Carter Williams, Josh Thompson, Nick Gonzalez, Paul Daly, Bang Ludwig.
Yep.
So you're talking about some names. So the card was fun. And to me, you touched on it, the promotion, man, and the co-promotion. That to me was something that even to this day, I'll be honest with you, man, I wish we would see more of outside of the UFC. I get why the UFC is not ever going to do it. I totally understand why. But for everybody else, man, I just feel like it would add so much when you're not worried about just your roster. You're able to access, the roster of other organizations as well. And I know it's tough to do, man. It's not easy because there's so many, question marks. Well, what network does it air on? Who gets the rights fees? What, who's on the canvas? There's so many questions. So it's not easy. It's not as easy as I think some people might think. We're like, yeah, they should just co-promote. There's a lot more to it than that. But they figured out a way to do it, and I was like, man, this is awesome. And Frank Shamrock versus Phil Baroni, man, that kind of captured that moment for me, and it was a fun fight. So there's my 5, Shamrock versus Baroni.
Yeah, that was a great one. And like you said, it was in that co-promotion era where we thought it was probably going to be, the next fight straight away because, we talk about Their first one, Gracie versus Shamrock, to open things up. Well, it was Phil Baroni in the commentary booth. By the way, you had like Forrest Whitaker and Chuck Norris at that first show. Not bad for Scott Coker doing some celebrity pulling, but you had Phil Baroni in the commentary booth, and he kind of revealed, he's like, I don't know how I should act here because I'm probably set to fight the winner, kind of setting the table for this fight. Yep. And giving a shout to our colleagues, George and Goes, they interviewed Baroni's side on this fight, and John, you've been cage side for how many? Certain fighters aren't the same after, that change them. And this is one that Phil Baroni himself readily admitted that he wasn't the same after. And even though Phil Baroni had that style, and his style, like you said, was shown in this fight, and perhaps that wasn't a surprise, but you can also see, especially with the beating that he had to take after being dropped, like you said, after Frank faked him out, you see, Baroni wasn't kidding. You could see how that fight could change a man.
No question about it. It was a vicious finish, but, man, just a great moment in history for me.
Great number 5. Mine is going to come about 4 years later. That one was in 2007, of course. I mentioned women's MMA, and Scott Coker, I want to say he doesn't get enough credit, but I think he does for anybody that knows their history. He was the guy to really first invest on the women's MMA in the forefront. And one of my favorite female fighters that doesn't get talked about a lot was Marloes Coenen, John. And she was the bantamweight champion. She, of course, fought at featherweight. Maybe, perhaps other fans maybe were tuning in at the tail end of her career when they were trying to get someone to fight Cyborg, right? But they needed someone to fill those Cyborg and Carano shoes. Not to step on that. And Marloes Coenen, in my opinion, did a really good job at representing herself. And she owns kind of the female version of Anderson Silva versus Chael Sonnen 1, which was my selection here. Marloes Coenen versus Liz Carmouche, who would go on to show that she would either be a historical setting spoiler or a historical setting close to spoiler throughout her career. This was our first taste of Carmouche, who was a huge underdog. I think she took this fight on somewhat short notice. This wasn't, I think they wanted Misha, but Misha was injured, and Misha would fight for the title after this. But yes, it was similar to Sonnen versus Anderson Silva, and you essentially have, Liz Carmouche taking it to, getting the full mount, like banking 10-8s on Marloes Coenen. And I'm watching back this fight recently, John, and I'm like, male or female, both, I can't see fights being allowed to go this long and mount, regardless of the damage. And they're letting this one play out, and thankfully they did, because of course she gets not a round 5, a round 4, but still a dramatic finish nonetheless. A triangle off a desperate takedown in the championship rounds, and endears herself to the Ohio audience, who, nothing wrong with Ohio. They got some of the best MMA audience as far as loudness, but this is definitely a USA era, and she won the crowd over, and it was really great to see. Makes my number 5.
That's a great call, man. Marloes Coenen, I think you're right, underappreciated. I think if you weren't following, women's MMA during the early years of development, or you weren't paying attention to Strikeforce, she fought a lot of big names. And by the way, Carmouche, fights nothing but killers in her whole career. But yeah, Marloes Coenen is fantastic. Still around the game. She does the Dutch broadcasting, I believe, for Bellator. So you see her kind of coming in and out of events. So it's always great to see her. She's a class act, man. She's a great fighter, phenomenal individual as well, and carries herself with a ton of class. And she had a great career.
Yeah, some things don't, I don't want to say age well, but perhaps, your number one gets knocked off at a certain point in time. But no, she's probably still my favorite female fighter. If there's a gun in my head and you had to make me pick one.
No question about it. She's right up there. She's one of the best pound for pound of all time, man. She really does deserve some love. So good shout there. Good shout on that one.
All right, let's climb this ladder, John. What did you get for number 4? All
right. Number 4, Robbie Lawler versus Melvin Manhoff, January 2010. Come on, dude.
Oh, man.
Again, this is kind of this crossover type fight, yes. Right? Robbie Lawler's got the history in the UFC. Melvin Manhoff's been fighting over in Japan, in Europe, that sort of thing. So it's almost like a fantasy fight, right? And stylistically, if you've watched these guys fight, they can bang. Obviously, Lawler, certainly anybody listening to this knows his history. Manhoff, I would imagine you do as well, but just if you didn't, an absolute marauder, man. This dude is an angry little man just coming to knock you out as quick as he can. And but in this fight, Melvin Manhoff, so on paper, it's going to be fireworks, but you didn't know exactly how. And Melvin Manhoff, again, somebody that has had an issue with a gas tank over the course of his career. He did come in so guns blazing every single fight that if you could survive that initial barrage, it's kind of like facing Tyson on Tyson's Punch Out or whatever, right? Like you got to get through that first, you got to get through that first minute 30, bro, and it ain't gonna happen. So it was like that. But Melvin actually in this one came out attacking the legs, and I mean some of the nastiest leg kicks you've ever seen. Like Jose Aldo would look at it and be like, "Whoa, I don't want to see those, man. Those are nasty," and just tearing the leg apart. Lawler is visibly limping, and Melvin's pacing himself. He's doing the right things. He's not going for the kill. He's letting the finish come to him, and then all of a sudden, one right hand, boom, and he's out cold, man. I mean, out cold on the deck. Robbie's going to celebrate, but he can barely even walk to celebrate. I mean, just unbelievable comeback. I mean, you're literally sitting there going, I cannot believe how bad Robbie Lawler is losing right now, just being precision taken apart by this killer. And then one shot ends it all. So my number 4, Robbie Lawler versus Melvin Manhoff.
That's a great shout there. That's a fantastic shout. Was that the classic Robbie Lawler falling asleep at the press conference, John? Was it that one or?
Bro, that Robbie Lawler was crazy. Robbie Lawler has had some stages in his career. I listen. I can honestly tell you, I remember a time in the career where I had like Strikeforce PR going, "Hey, Robbie Lawler's available right now. Would you like to talk to him?" And I'm like, "Nah, I'm good, man." Like he just did not want to do media at all. Like literally, and I could never. I mean, you could always tell that he wasn't really interested in doing media. Like you said, falling asleep at press conferences, which was just absolutely amazing. But I don't think he necessarily was like rude. He would just, if you asked him a yes or no question, you damn sure were going to get a yes or no answer, and there would be no elaboration whatsoever. So it kind of forced you as a journalist to think things through a little bit more and to be sure and ask. In fact, was that the Adlan Amagov fight? I'll share another little Strikeforce story. So Robbie Lawler, I will credit him for having one of the greatest headlines in the history of MMA Junkie because was trying to get him to talk a little bit. I think it was the Amagov fight. I know it was the Strikeforce.
Apologize for that interruption, but John, you were queuing up an Adlan Amagov story in relation to your number 4 that we're talking about, which of course was Robbie Lawler's unforgettable fight there with Melvin Manhoff. Tell us where you were going with that in relation to.
Yeah, no worries. So Lawler's getting ready for this fight. We're interviewing him ahead of time, and he had been fighting a bunch of grapplers up to that point. So now he's facing a striker. I says, "Is this the perfect opponent for you?" And he says, "No." And I'm like, "Well, what would be the perfect opponent?" And he said, "Somebody with no arms and no legs." And Adam Hill chimed in, "How would you beat him?" And without skipping a beat, Robbie Lawler just said, "Ground and pound." Like, all right. So it was an interesting little exchange. So the headline I ended up going with for MMA Junkie was, "With limbless opponent unavailable, Robbie Lawler settles for Adlan Amagov."
Dude, that's got to be, if we're doing top 5 MMA headlines, how is that not up in the mix?
I mean,
that's great.
Come on.
That's great.
I mean, yeah, that's how we took a nothing interview and made something kind of fun out of it.
Take note, both fighters and media on that one.
Yeah, Robbie was at a special time. He's much better now, and I think he's finally embraced it and kind of changed a little bit. But that was an interesting era where he didn't like talking much. Not that he's a real chatterbox now, but anyway, that fight, Robbie Lawler versus Melvin Manhoff, amazing. That's my number 4.
That was a great one, and just to add into that, I remember because it was an open stance matchup, so you're like, okay, are the leg kicks going to be there as much on the southpaw Robbie Lawler? No, didn't matter. You just see Robbie's like lead leg, flinging up in the air every time he kicked it, and you're just like, ooh, you were just, you were feeling the sways of the boat, if you will, even though we're just watching, thankfully, from the comfort of our homes. But yeah, that's an unforgettable one, a good number 4. And it leads to my number 4 here. This is a classic. There's a lot of series, rematches, perhaps even a trilogy, which I'm going to touch on here. We could pick, a couple from that trilogy. But for me, seldom is the second better than the first. But for me, the second is better than the first and third. And that was Gilbert Melendez versus Josh Thompson 2 back in 2009, December 19th. I really love this fight. It's up there on other lists of mine, and for good reason. It's a fun fight from start to finish, particularly round 2, because for people that don't know, the first fight goes to Josh Thompson. I believe he actually even, all 3 judges give all 3 rounds to Josh Thompson. It's not a controversial decision by any means. Not like the third fight where you can make arguments per se. However, once we're getting into the first and second round, you really start to see Gilbert Melendez turn the tide. And it's great because I always picture El Nino hitting body shots on that epic Diego Sanchez fight that's burned into our brain. But El Nino, Gilbert Melendez, his boxing was still in a developing era, and it was Josh Thompson that was the one that was going to the body with great affect in this fight, but would get clipped, of course, with Gilbert Melendez's brawling sensibilities. And it was a great fight, and by the end of it, I think it's like 48-47 or 49-46, no question, for Gilbert Melendez. But just two great fighters, a great trilogy. And John, I don't think he gets talked about it much when you're talking about fighters with chins or are durable, but like, is Gilbert Melendez one of the most durable fighters in MMA? Like, looking what we've seen with him take from body shots, leg kicks from Barbosa to Stevens, to all the headshots?
Well, first, let me just say you threw me for a loop because when you mentioned legendary trilogies in Strikeforce, I, of course, thought you were going with Bobby Volker versus Roger Bowling, the trilogy that we just have up there in the echelons of
Great shout. Anyway. Great shout.
But no, listen, you're right, man. I feel for anybody that didn't get a chance to watch this era Gilbert Melendez. If you weren't paying attention to Strikeforce then, you didn't get the full breadth of his talent and his skills when he came to the UFC. Obviously, that run, didn't necessarily go as expected. Gave us, some great moments, of course, but you didn't get to see when, there was a conversation that Gilbert Melendez was the top lightweight in the world. So, and then, of course, Josh Thompson as well. I mean, this as you said, the whole trilogy was fantastic. I mean, if you're writing a history of Strikeforce, you can't not mention this trilogy. I mean, these two amazing fighters, were backbones and poster guys of the company, and they came together for some fantastic fights.
No doubt. Yeah, and again, you could split hairs as far as the second or the third, but and you hear it in the commentary too. They're asking for it by the fourth round, and by the fifth round, it's all but a guarantee. They're promising you another great fight, which is really dangerous to do in MMA. But if you are going to do it, the lightweight division, much less these two, is a pretty good place to throw your dart. So that's my dart for number 4. I'm surprised there's no crossover yet, but then again, I shouldn't be, because there really is a lot of great fights. I mean, I can't belabor that point enough, right?
No doubt about it. And listen, that kind of brings me into my number 3, which I would preface it by saying this, because, when you talk about top fives, as you said, it's not always just the best fights, so to speak. I mean, I think that's a little bit different, right? If we're just ranking like the 5 greatest fights or whatever. I mean, we get to have a little fun with this. So for me, number 3 is going to be Fabricio Verdum versus Fedor Emelianenko. Not necessarily the greatest fight of all time, but historical, man. That moment I will never forget. I mean, of course, man. I never got to make it to Japan for a Pride fight. I did make it to Japan for a UFC, but I never got to see Pride in its heyday in person. And so the opportunity once Fedor Emelianenko came to the United States and to watch some of his fights. I mean, aura about him, even to this day. I mean, even though now we're obviously in the tail stages of his career, there's still an aura about Fedor Emelianenko when he steps into the ring, or when he's in a room. Man, there's just the way he carries himself is incredible. So to be a part of that was amazing, and then to see the epic win streak snap by Fabricio Verdum was incredible. And so it was amazing to be there. I was in person for that. It was amazing to be there. But the thing that will always stand out to me about this was not necessarily just the fight itself, because there was an incredible reaction where everybody's just like, oh my God, Fedor just lost. But it was afterwards in the post-fight press conference. And Fedor Emelianenko is up at the table, at the dais, in the press room in the Shark Tank, which are the SAP Center now, where this fight was. It's just kind of a little room in the back, and it's off the main hallway where the locker rooms and all that stuff are. But Fedor's up there. He's starting to talk, and obviously everything's very stoic, and everybody's kind of shell shocked a little bit. And in the back, you can hear Fabricio Verdum out in the hallway, and his team celebrating. Hey, oh boy, hey. It's just like, man, here's Fedor like having to like answer these questions about what happened and what went wrong, and reflecting on all his time without losing. And in the outside, you can hear just the party and the celebration going on with Verdum and that crew. So, just a fight memory, man, that I'll never forget. So that's why, for me, like I said, maybe it's not on your list of greatest fights of all time, but for me, historical moments and big time in Strikeforce, give me Verdum versus Fedor.
I love that that little tidbit there with the SAP Center in the media room, because even just watching the footage back, you could pick up on that. And knowing Verdum, it was probably a soccer chant or something, probably going ole 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 ole,
Of
Verdum,
course.
Verdum.
Over the top, just scream. Oh man, I was like, man, poor Fedor. He's got to sit here and listen to all this.
That image gives me a UFC, I think, 94 flashback of BJ Penn just beating the crap out of, like, looking at George St. Pierre, like, did that just happen? And then GSP and his team doing the soccer chant and doing the celebration in the ring. You just that juxtaposition is really powerful, right? To see in our sport. And that's a great pick. And again, another shout to MMA Junkie Radio and our colleagues there at George and Goes. I remember that show, everybody calling in the next day. It was like a bizarro world. So if their callers had a certain personality, they would have the opposite personality. And it was like, it sounds silly, folks, but it was just something that permeated the scene. I mean, even the realists, so to speak, right, John? Aura sounds funny, but even the realists amongst us that were predicting Fedor's end to come soon after seeing him narrowly escaping names like Brett Rogers, I still don't even think those people were banking on Verdum to pull it off, which says how shocking it was.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, we thought that he had some talents that he could be a little bit of a threat, but not like that. I mean, just not getting it done so quickly and the way he did it, just very, very impressive. Man, it just the tide changed in a second. You know, it was wild. But just goes to show you, by the way, the grappling skills of Fabricio Verdum, man. The guy, obviously he's known most for his MMA talents, but his jiu-jitsu really is off the charts.
And that was part of the run where he went to show it. And even though he lost a lot of crucial fights, if we're playing that game, he still cemented his spot in the history books with that one for sure, regardless. So, great number 3. My number 3, I'm going back to the ladies here. You know, I got to give the ladies some love, and this one was an important one in history. This happened in 2012, and this was Miesha Tate versus Julie Kedzie. This was it was a fun fight for as long as it lasted. It went 3 rounds, so it lasted pretty long, but there was a finish. It was back and forth. Julie Kedzie, who I believe has a Taekwondo background, obviously the more powerful striker. You got two, athletic, good-looking, smart, intelligent, checking literally all the boxes as far as what you want to represent the sport at that time, which comes in handy because one Dana White, who, folks, at this time, he was not sold. In fact, Miesha Tate was coming off of her loss to Ronda Rousey, which was a brutal finish that hurt her arm. So we were curious to see what kind of condition she would come in. Obviously, Rousey was making noise at that point. I say that for context. And Dana White, lo and behold, was tuning in. As I don't have the tweet in front of me because I'm a poor podcast host, but he does, release a legendary tweet as far as saying, now that is an effing fight or something along those lines, giving credit, which was the first time, if you follow Dana White, that he was really even giving credit to the ladies. And this is a fight that's not talked about. We know about Rousey. We know about her effect and her connection with Dana. But this is kind of the quiet Flint lighter, and just a really fun fight to revisit that's not talked about enough, in my opinion. Of course, hardcores know all about this one, so I just want to give that one a shout, and you should really go back and watch Miesha Tate versus Julie Kedzie.
It's a great fight. It's a great shout. Like you said, kind of unearthing some of the fights that people may have skipped, and that was a really good one. And as you said, came at a really kind of a critical time in Miesha Tate's career, but also a critical time in what would eventually be, the women's divisions in the UFC, and just crazy to think, man, what a short period of time we went from, no women in the UFC and the infamous Dana line that they'll never be in to now. I mean, they're among the most popular fighters in the sport, and we've got 4 divisions in the UFC. So, it was a very, very crucial time to say the least.
And yeah, I mean, and again, that back to Scott Coker and Rich Chu as well for the matchmaking, because kind of back to your number 3 as well, as much as you could, criticize and call a lot of it smash making with the way the odds were, right? As far as how the betting odds reflected a lot of these matches, there were still plenty of fun, competitive, and meaningful fights like Tate or Kedzie, and which you talked about one, and there's plenty of others perhaps we'll mention before we get out of here, John. But it also set up some of the biggest falls and greatest upsets in our sport, barring any era or division or organization, happen under the Strikeforce banner. So you got to make sure you mention those with the criticisms for the matchmaking, because you just really got a chaos of all the checkboxes.
Yeah, you really did. They had some fun with it at times, and look, they did a great job of developing talent, and the women's divisions especially was intriguing. And it takes me on number 2 because you kind of touched on it there, but I wanted to shy away from this, but I just couldn't, man. Ronda Rousey versus Miesha Tate, March 2012. That's my number 2. It's an obvious pick, like so obvious that I almost thought, come on, man, am I just mailing it in here? But no, you know what, man? I mean, the fight is such a good fight. We really see the character of Miesha Tate, but we also see the tenacity of Ronda Rousey as well. And I know it's easy to rewrite history and go back and say, she was never that good, and I was never a fan, and blah, blah, blah. I mean, the way she handled the end of her career understandably deserves criticism, and I don't think anybody wishes it would have ended the way it did and the way she handled things. But this was the beginning of Ronda Rousey. Now, obviously here in Las Vegas, I had been fortunate enough to call some of her amateur fights, so I saw this coming. I said, oh my gosh, the talent that this woman possesses is on a different level. She's about to take the women's game by storm, because at the time, listen, the women's divisions weren't as deep. I mean, it's just fair to say women didn't have opportunities to fight professionally, so why would they do it? You know what I mean? So Ronda was on a different level athletically, and in this fight, we saw her get tested. We saw, she had been tearing through opposition, but we saw her get tested by Miesha Tate. But she was tested and she got through it. She got out of some bad positions herself. Ends up with the famous head and arm throw that is so popular in the women's game overall. Moves to mount and then sets up the armbar beautifully, breaks the grip to get the finish. As you said, Miesha did not want to tap. The arm extended there, and it looked rough. So, I mean, I thought it was a great fight all the way around. But also, this was that fight that was starting to get the UFC push. You know what I mean? Even though it was in Strikeforce, this is Zuffa-era Strikeforce. So, I remember clearly, Ronda and Miesha both doing, like, press conferences that hadn't been done before, and then bringing them on the media rounds and, weeks out and that sort of thing. So this was the first time they really both started getting that push from the UFC PR team as a Strikeforce fight. So it was cool to see, and you could see the women's game really starting to get some attention. And to me, this fight was just a pivotal fight, and an iconic moment. So even though it's maybe an easy choice, I just had to put it in there at number 2.
No, that's a great choice. I mean, March 3rd, 2012, so this fits under the Zuffa banner. So, yeah, that tie-in, you're right. I totally missed that. Perhaps because you're right, the reach and the machine, the PR machine, that was powerful back then as it is now. And to have that behind, and we see it kind of, coming together and congealing, it really was a special time. That's a great selection. Of course, they have a great rematch, which makes my top 5 female fights. But as far as this fight, I remember it was really tough for me too, John, because I became a fan of Miesha Tate. She was on the MMA Junkie radio shows, like we mentioned. However, just like you had your own connection, you called Ronda Rousey's fights by this point. Of course, we were referring to her amateur career and Tough Enough. And Ronda Rousey, coming through the highest stand gym and under Gene LaBelle, shared a grappling lineage with myself and Neil Melanson of the team I was operating under on that time. So it was kind of hard because I was a Miesha Tate fan and my heart was with Miesha, but part of me was like, should I be rooting for this Ronda girl? Because she's my lineage. I got to be rooting for her to do well. And you just see her brutalize Miesha's arm. It was so hard to watch because you're happy for Ronda at one part. You got to watch her in Tough Enough, or in your case, John, call her fights. But then you're watching just, Miesha and her journey, her arm just get mangled from this girl who came out of nowhere.
Yeah, no, listen, I think if you go back and watch that fight, you'll really see, like I said, the character of both women. I mean, it was more of a test. I mean, Ronda Rousey at that point, had been beating people in seconds, and this was a first-round finish, but it was very late in the first round. And again, Miesha came out aggressive, pressed forward, didn't have the greatest striking, so didn't really threaten her there, but got in tight, initiated some grappling exchanges, and of course we know how Ronda was so proficient in the clinch, man. That was a bad spot to be with her. But man, when you see the high level reversals and some of the transitions from both ladies, it's impressive. And like I said, I mean, Ronda, it's easy to be a front runner. It's easy to be a front runner, but she was tested and pushed in a little bit. And I think that's one of the reasons, this rivalry was so fun. They had competitive fights, even though, they went Ronda's direction, they were still competitive, and the way their styles matched up was fun. And of course, like you said, the way their personalities matched up. I mean, find me a person on earth with a bad thing to say about Miesha Tate. You know what I mean? It's not going to happen. Meanwhile, Ronda, different personality, brash, bold, not afraid to say what she's going to do to you, not afraid to put a target on her back. And let's be clear, I mean, Ronda understood, what it meant, to market herself a little bit. And I think she got that. She grew up a pro wrestling fan. She understood what it meant to be a character. I mean, I can tell you, behind the scenes, Ronda. Now, at the end, of course, Ronda kind of shut everybody out. But up until that point, I mean, I can tell you, Ronda was still very pleasant behind the scenes. And hey, John, how you doing? Good to see you. I remember seeing her at a Tough Enough event where she was there. I want to say, I don't remember if it was a Jessamine fight or a Marina fight. They both came through Tough Enough.
Yeah, sure. It sounds familiar.
But, yeah. So the fourth, but Ronda was there and she came up and gave me a big hug and just, how you doing and all those things. So she was, she understood how to put it on for the cameras. But this was good, man. I mean, again, and this really started to launch, the women into the UFC and the superstar that Ronda would become. I mean, again, easy to rewrite history now and say that, she wasn't that good, but I'm telling you, influential. I mean, superstar. Like, I mean, she's up there with Conor McGregor and Brock Lesnar. I mean, as the biggest stars we've seen in the sport. The numbers supported it, and she was transformative too. I'll never forget in her UFC career. I think it was before the Alexis Davis fight. They did an open workout at Fashion Show Mall, and man, there were like little girls that were there that were like crying and shaking. I've always said it was like the Beatles, like the old film of the Beatles. Were like, I mean, they were like that just to see Ronda. I mean, even the Carmouche fight. I remember an open workout at a UFC gym in SoCal, and seeing like soccer moms and their daughters at an open workout for like the first time ever. You know what I mean? That never happened. So, man, she just impacted a different audience. And I know it's easy to hate on Ronda Rousey, but man, her impact to the sport as a whole can't be denied. Man, it opened the door for all these women to compete. And most of the women on the roster today will still say that, like, hey, we owe Ronda a great favor, man. She got us into this. I mean, they still have reverence for her, even if they don't necessarily like the way she handled the end of her career. So this was a big moment. Like I said, yeah. I thought it was kind of an easy one. I was like, maybe I'm not bringing my A game to this list. Dan Tom's never going to have me on again. It took me so long to get here the first time. Now he's never going to have me again. But I just thought it was too big to leave off.
No, you're right. It's a super important one, and it curtailed beautifully with the Tate versus Kedzie one as far as that goes. So that's great there. And I think the common thread with those fights, you mentioned spotlight, right? And I don't think anybody can deny that Ronda brought it into the spotlight, and that was really well said on that, John. But I feel like when I go back and watch these fights, it's like these girls knew that, because at the time, Strikeforce was the biggest stage and was the biggest spotlight for those fighters. Now, the male fighters, you could still make that argument, which we proved was unfair, as we saw how well the Strikeforce male fighters did. However, there was that stigma they faced, like WEC fighters face. What? Is it UFC? Is it UFC? I mean, the females, they weren't supposed to be doing it in the first place, according to society, right? And they knew this was the biggest spotlight they had, and I loved it because it's almost like they knew that and they brought everything to the table. Like, they were just giving it all and making great accounts for women's MMA. So props to them and props to the choices there. All right. What's up, John? You want to add something?
No, I was just going to say, I mean, you make a great comparison there. You're dead right about the WC, man. It was like this was the top level, so they carried themselves with a little bit of extra responsibility on their shoulders, and I think they knew that. So, they knew they were representing the very best in the world at that time. The WC comparison is perfect. Yep,
definitely. And my number 2 is going to kind of go back to the NorCal contingent, and it's like it's funny. It's almost like, and they did it organically. A lot of these were head-to-head matchups from Frank Shamrock to Kung Lee to Frank Shamrock to Nick Diaz, like these different NorCal sects they were able to kind of hang their hat on to who was the guy that's going to own the HP Pavilion, the Shark Tank Pavilion. We're going to build those San Jose shows around, even after they started expanding to other places like we mentioned, like Ohio. And I mentioned Kung Lee. He was definitely one of those guys, and people forget, and I don't know if it was because of Kung Lee. I know he had some experience on like MTV and reality shows for his Sanda fights or fighting over in Thailand and Southeast Asia. I mean, I know I was familiar with him before I was familiar with Strikeforce, for example, and I'm sure Coker was familiar with that fact, right? Hence building around this guy. And it wasn't just some cheap build, though. I mean, because even hardcore fans, and granted this didn't age well, but who are we comparing the fantasy? Like, we got to see him face Anderson Silva, Kung Lee, and that became less appealing, of course, as time went on. But this is during a little period while that is going on. And like I said about the matchmaking, for as much as you can criticize, we're building around these stars to get him in, but the competitive matching, you got to go look at the prelims, and you got to look, kind of lower Well, not necessarily. Some of those billing fights were more competitive than they let on, and Scott Smith versus Kung Lee was one of those. Of course, I'm talking about Scott Smith versus Kung Lee 1, where the upset happened. He was not supposed to win. He was brought in. He was coming off of a loss to Nick Diaz, who just looked great moving up to welterweight in that fight, by the way. Just schooled Scott Smith. Scott Smith was pretty much brought in to lose. Was I imagine a sizable underdog. I don't have the odds in front of me. And it shows why. I mean, like, Kung Lee, who's coming off the movie set, is literally landing movie-like kicks. He's landing spinning side kicks, spinning hook kicks. That's knocking, like, they're just touching Scott Smith and he's getting knocked down. You're like, dude, how is this guy going to survive the round? And Scott Smith just steadily takes his beating round by round, and late in the fight starts to come on as Kung starts to tire and pours it on. And it's just an emphatic comeback, and it's a great for a guy like Scott Smith who had kind of a limited arsenal. I don't say that as a knock. I mean, he was as advertised an action fighter. This guy looks like Joaquin Phoenix if you put him on like a steroid stack. Not saying anything towards Scott Smith. If anything, that's a compliment, right? Comparing him to a guy like Joaquin. You know what I'm trying to say here. The point is he throws a feint right, left hook, clips Kung Lee beautifully, and it's the beginning of the end, and it's one of the for sure Rocky moments Strikeforce produced.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, Scott Smith had a couple of those in his career, right? I mean, this guy was always in great fights. Probably an underappreciated name overall, man. You know, in the annals of time. You know, maybe a little bit forgotten, but had some amazing fights. You knew if he was in the cage, it was going to be fun, man.
Yeah.
And you know what, man? You're dead right on this fight, and I like the fact that you included it because tipping my hand a little bit towards my number one, but I don't have a Kung Lee fight on my list, and I felt a little awkward about that because I thought, well, man, I really, again, if you're writing the book of the history of Strikeforce, how can you leave Kung Lee out of it? Because, you know, again, as you said, you know, identified by Coker, homegrown, brought up, you know, through the organization, fun to watch. I mean, that dude, like the style that he brought to the table was, you know, revolutionary. It wasn't something we were seeing other people do. So, you know, Kung Lee's career obviously kind of ended in controversy and you know, continues to be, you know, an opponent against the UFC, I guess, at this point, and all the controversy that surrounded his career. But this was a great fight in a moment in time, and yeah, even though Kung Lee's on the short end of this, you gotta have his name on lists like this. I mean, when you're boiling it down to 5, it's tough. But I'm glad you have some Kung Lee representation on here because, man, just tough to describe. Like the dude was just something different, man. It was unique, and you know, it was kind of, especially I think during that time when. Man, it felt like mixed martial artists were all becoming like the same, right? Like everybody stopped being specialists, and it's like, well, you know, now I'm just this generic blueprint of, well, I do a little bit of wrestling, I do a little, you know what I mean? Everybody's kind of this generic fighter.
1-2 leg kick, 1-2 leg kick.
That's it, man. And you know, and I think I think we see it in waves, to be honest with you. But I mean, you know, remaining a specialist in something stands for something because you're different. You know, you do present unique problems, and I think that's always beneficial when you got one area that you're just so much light years above other people. I mean, I think that's beneficial. I mean, I guess, you know, today if you want to make a comparison, like an Israel Adesanya might be a comparison to Kung Lee in terms, you know, not quite as much of a different style as Kung had, but, you know, being a specialist like that,
right.
You know, Damian Maia's jiu-jitsu being off the charts, you know, things like that. So I'm glad Kung Lee's on there, and this was a great fight. And again, Scott Smith, I mean, kind of glad to see his name on here, even though, you know, maybe not a Hall of Famer. I mean, the dude scrapped every time he brought it.
Yeah, whether he was winning by left hook in this fight or losing by left hook, you know, against guys like Daly, he was a memorable guy. And I like the comparison as far as specialists and as far as that talk. You're right. In any era, there's a certain respect you got to pay, whether you're a fan of that fight style or not, of someone that's able to make it work in the crazy jungle that is mixed martial arts. Because as we saw in all eras of the sport, successful guys or not, it wasn't easy. It's not easy to do. So much respect there. And yeah, he was also one of the first Sanda guys. Of course, Wushu Sanda. There's a different sects of that martial art. It's one of the only martial arts that was kind of allowed in as far as traditional martial arts in Russia. So actually now we see more of that through the Russian brand of that, like these Dagestani guys, like what's that guy, Magomed Mustafayev. I think he's got a couple spin kick knockouts under the UFC banner, right? So we might have like looked at it like flashy for back then with the 2007 goggles on, but now it's kind of funny to see things that we were like, no one besides Kung Lee is going to make that work, and now we've kind of slowly seen under our own eyes. We're like, oh, it's all kind of been integrated, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's a creative striking art, but it's got some clinch work as well. So I mean, I think that was what was beneficial for him.
Absolutely. Number one time. I feel like we could have some crossover here, John. I don't know. The fact that this fight, my number one hasn't been mentioned, so I'm extra excited on that note to know what your number one is.
Well, I'll be honest with you. I was thinking the same thing all along. I'm like, surely my number one's going to show up somewhere, and it didn't. So I think we might have come to the same conclusion. But number one for me is Nick Diaz versus Paul Daly, April 2011. Probably the greatest one-round fight of all time in any organization. I mean, you just take the personalities of these two, the figures that they are, and you put them in the cage together. I mean, this is name value. There's heat between them. I mean, real heat after the weigh-ins, even at the pre-fight face-off in the cage. You know, Daly's just up in there smiling at him, you know, being the punk that he likes to be. And you got Diaz, you know, barking back at him like, what, bitch? You know what I mean? Just going at him. And then it starts immediately, and there's ebbs and flows, and it's going back and forth, and both guys are landing, and what's happened. And then, you know, Diaz gets dropped at the end of the first round. You're like, oh, my God, he's not going to survive. But, he's moving his head. He's finding a way. He's using his jiu-jitsu to buy him time. Gets back up. There's a stand-up, and then the volume striker comes out and lands the big knockout. Obviously Nick Diaz is such a loved fighter, man. I mean, he has such a fervent fan base, and then you add in Paul Daly, who has been a part of some very heated rivalries during his career. I mean, he knows how to sell a fight, and what he brings to the table is fun, and just an absolute killer on the feet. But he knows how to play the bad guy and has no problem doing it. And man, it just all came together perfect. As I said, to me, in any organization, one of the greatest one-round fights of all time. I don't know that you can pack more action into a single round. And I'm imagining we're on the same page. Nick Diaz versus Paul Daly.
Yes, we are. That's great. I mean, you were right. Almost in any organization, I don't know if you went as far as to say combat sport. My boxing knowledge and kickboxing knowledge isn't vast like it is MMA, but I can't think of a single round. I mean, obviously, you got, Hagler and Hearns, which goes beyond one round, but obviously their first round was a legendary part of that story. But yeah, I mean, in other words, you have to go into other sports deep in the history just to find rounds that could compete. I think we would be coming across the same number one, John, if I had you on for top 5 rounds in MMA. I think this is kind of another undeniable number one. You can't get around.
Yeah.
You don't have to put this as a number one, though, but I think that me and you both did. For similar reasons. Now, mind you, I have the date written next to this fight, and I think that's important for the point of this era in context. It's April 9th, 2011. Now, not specifically the day. This isn't a combat flashback. I'm not going to pull on you folks. But the year, 2011, this is when, the Zuffa purchase, we kind of know what's coming. WEC and other things have already been folded down. Even the Japan scene, Pride went down, of course, years by this point, but something called Dream came along, and in my opinion, peaked about 2010. It starts kind of, even that, in my opinion, starts falling down, and the Asian scene starts kind of quieting down. So MMA is really kind of coming under this blanket. And don't get me wrong, there's positives where maybe we can see the fights we wanted to see. It's not like we're not UFC fans. Let's see what they do with it. Let's there were pros, but for hardcores like us, John, let's be honest, there was part of us that we kind of knew that this was the last of a dying breed, that that the UFC was already kind of getting into the mainstream. We are already in the Brock Lesnar golden era has already hit, okay? So UFC is already kind of making that jump. 2011, you got the announcement, UFC is going to Big Fox. I mean, everything that was under our hardcore umbrella is being pushed into the spotlight, and there's only a little bit of crumbs left over. These guys like Paul Daly, Semtex, who hardcores knew about, Nick Diaz, who of course was even a hardcore favorite back then, and this was just such an important era. It's like before that band you've been following, before they go big and become too cool. Like, there is so much of that in this particular era, and it's very, very well represented in Strikeforce, particularly Nick Diaz versus Paul Daly.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think that was the other thing too that made Strikeforce a little bit more fun, as well as the fact that It wasn't about world rankings or necessary. You know what I mean? Like, you could just make fights. You didn't have to, have a rankings. Well, why, does it make sense? I've got to justify this. I mean, it didn't matter. You just put some names together and say, let's go in there and throw down. I think that's what made the card so fun. And you're right, man. This was a key time where, the kind of the writing was on the wall. Like you said, things going to the mainstream, which is cool, but was also a little bit worried. Like, is our sport going to stay the same, or are they going to try to change it or bastardize it as it goes out in front of this bigger audience? So, man, a key time and just a phenomenal fight. And like I said, I mean, if that fight was any two people, like if you just take, Joe Smith against Mike Davis, just come up with some random generic name generators from a UFC game.
Right.
The fight would be amazing because it was that entertaining. I mean, the techniques that were on display, what was happening was great. But when you add in the fact that it's Nick Diaz and Paul Daly, you know what I mean? It just makes it that much better. So, just a special moment, man. That was a great fight. And it was funny as we were going along. I'm like, I know he's got to have this in here somewhere. And so when it wasn't number 2, I thought, man, I bet we're both sitting on number 1.
And another perfect part of that fight is how about Big John? Just being there. I mean, one of the we don't highlight refereeing performances, but there's parts like you said. He gets hit with Paul Daly's best shot, that left hook. He almost goes flat for a second, and we've seen it before. Fighters recover, but at the same time, you can't blame a ref because most refs will be triggered to go in. But Big John, you could just see him. He's got all the angles the whole time. His eyes is on the action. And even with a second left, you're like, was that too early? And, I know Daly was upset, but he wasn't exactly like protesting the stoppage, or as our former colleague Ben Folks would say, he didn't pass the what the fuck test. So there wasn't an argument, even though there was a second left. I mean, it was such a tight, close call, but called so perfectly in a perfect fight that everybody's part played together so well in that little one-round sequence.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, if you go back and watch it, you could make the argument that it was a little bit early, right? Like the final shots weren't exactly landing clean. Now, and I always preface this to anybody. I always say, do not make an argument about a stoppage being early if it has anything to do with how much time is left in the round.
Yes.
The referees are instructed not to worry about that. So you can't say, well, it was only 2 seconds. The referees are told, do not worry about time. You are trying to, if it's 4:59.9 and somebody's not, intelligently defending themselves, you got to stop it right there. So you go back and watch it and you think, man, is that a little bit early? But yeah, you look at Daly's condition afterwards. He's not popping back to his feet. It's not as if he's struggling, man. He's hurting. I think he's dazed for a little bit. So yeah, as you said, he doesn't pass that what the fuck test. He's down for a little bit. So I think it was a good stoppage. And man, again, just a classic moment. And then the crowd reaction, and then of course Nick's strutting around and pointing at what's going on and doing what Nick does, being the gangster that he is. And yeah, man, what a great moment. Just an incredible fight.
Yep. I'm glad we came to that one on our number 1. I'm surprised we didn't have crossover, but I'm looking back, and this was a really good list and trip down memory lane. As I pull up a listener list here, John, do you mind sharing with the audience stuff that was this close to making your list?
Yeah, you know what, man? Like I said, I like the combination of our list together because, the fact that you had some Kung Lee on there, I felt bad that I didn't have that. Probably my top one that I struggled to eliminate, and I kind of wanted to enter it as a whole. You said we can kind of do this the way we want, but the Melendez versus Thompson trilogy, man, all 3 fights of that are great fights. And so I kind of wanted them to almost be one entry. And I guess, if I was taking something off, maybe it'd be Lawler Manhoff, because, that was just it was just fun, man.
Oh, that's just, yeah.
You know what I mean? So if I was trying to make it more like historical moments, but I tried to have a little blend of everything in there. So yeah, Melendez Thompson, I was glad you gave it some love. I kind of had a feeling you would. Those fights were too important not to. Too important not to. I was going to kind of weigh him in as a trilogy altogether. But that one was really hard for me to not have on the list. And then like I said, Kung Lee as well. I was glad you had him represented in there also.
Awesome. No, I totally agree with you on that. And there are some that's hard to not have on there, but I'm glad you went with a personal choice, John, because again, that's what this podcast is about. It's your list, it's my list, it's listeners' list. It's no fun to argue about one definitive list. There's enough of that's always going to go on in sports. That door will always be open. That argument will always be ongoing. This is just more of a fun specifics where we can give shouts to things that maybe you forgot about, and I love that Man Hufflawler shout. Benny Abs on Twitter, at Benjamin Abrigo from Fanside. It says, not sure I want y'all to discuss this because I'm here. may not have shed a tear watching it live in the arena, but Fedor Hendo was fun and sad for a Fedor stan.
Yeah, man, that really was just an incredible finish, right, man? A technique we hadn't seen used to end a fight very often. Just the position of the punches that ended the fight. Man, yeah, that was. I can understand the tear shed, man. It happens.
Yeah, you're right. That reference is pretty evergreen when we're trying to discuss that version of ground and pound when someone's turtled. I believe it's called the peekaboo uppercut, but it's much easier to just go Fedor Hendo. Oh yeah, those shots. Yeah. As
no
far
doubt
as
about it. You know what I'm talking about. You remember it.
The ones that I have a H next to it, I do these when I make the list, John, because as you know, and as the listeners know, I do a truncated version of these video-wise for MMA Junkie, and I'm allowed to squeeze in 2 of my honorable mentions. So those 2, what they're going to be probably is Daniel Cormier versus Bigfoot Silva, because I wanted to get some DC on there. Again, shouting out again Junkie Radio, but when they would do interviews with King Mo back in the day, that's how I got, I'm not sure about you, John, but that's how I got DC on my radar, was through those Junkie Radio interviews with King Mo, who was bragging about DC, and DC at that time was splitting time with King Mo and AKA. I remember getting DC to come on after UFC 127 and give us a real interesting corner take from that John Fitch BJ Penn fight. Him, explaining, BJ Penn can wrestle, don't underestimate him, and he's saying that Fitch didn't listen to him. And you kind of learn that DC was a force behind the scenes. So by the time he got to Strikeforce fighting Jeff Munson, I was licking my chops. I'm like, I want to see what this guy can do. And he really challenged on what just, a guy who doesn't have the best physique. He's not the biggest guy out there, which is, of course, why I can relate to him. And, get behind a guy like that. And you see him knock out Bigfoot. And that was kind of his coming out moment, so to speak.
That's great. I felt bad about not having Cormier on there as well. And I'll tell you a funny Cormier story. So I was actually at his professional debut just by chance. It was in Oklahoma. It was a Strikeforce Challenger show. We didn't travel to cover the Challenger Series shows because they were just smaller. They were prospects based, that sort of thing. So we just cover those from TV. But I happened to be in Dallas visiting my family where I grew up, and the show was happening in Oklahoma. And I was like, well, look, I'm here. I mean, it's not that far of a drive. I can go up there and let's just get a little on-site coverage. And Dan Stuff said, yeah, if you want to do that, go ahead. And it was Bixby, Oklahoma, I believe. And Cormier was on there. Same thing. I'd heard the rumblings behind the scene. I'd never seen the guy. I mean, obviously, this was his debut. Didn't know much about him, but I'd heard all the respect for him. And he weighed in, and obviously, Cormier is not Francis Ngannou when it comes to physique. But in the early days, he was even a little bit softer. He was probably closer to me than he was closer to Francis Ngannou at that time. And man, I saw him, and I remember just at the weigh-ins going, this is the guy. This is the guy that everybody's saying is going to be a beast. Like, are they sure they got? Is there another Daniel Cormier? What's going on here? But man, he showed his character in his first fight. Man, it was clear that he was still a raw product, but he weathered an early storm. Was able to get a second round TKO, and I was like, man, okay, maybe this guy does have a little something. So it was funny to see, and a little thing that the Junkie Radio guys can vouch for on this. So he fought in Strikeforce. We didn't go to his second fight because again it was a challenge. Then he went and fought overseas, and he was kind of coming along, and we didn't have an opportunity to take more pictures of him basically because we weren't in person with him. So we had this one weigh-in picture where he was admittedly looking a little more like me than he was himself. So he was a little soft.
Right.
And at one point, he's always had a great relationship with the Junkie Radio guys. But Goes actually called me up and he's like, "Hey, I need a favor." I was like, "What's going on?" He's like, Cormier's asking if there's any way we can no longer use that photo of him as a person, because he feels like he's changed a little bit since then. Maybe we could get an updated photo." I was like, "All right, fair enough, man. We'll get a new photo of him," and so that one is buried in the back end of MMA Junkie somewhere.
But that adds to the appeal, I mean, we just shouted Benny Abs there for being a Fedor fan. I was a Fedor fan myself, John, for the same reasons I was a BJ Penn fan. It was kind of an everyman looking guy. He was balding on. These guys were balding on top. They had a little bit of bellies on them. The guys were referencing, right? All three of them, but they were at points of time, in GOAT conversations, if not the GOAT, if we're talking about Fedor, by a lot of opinions. And I don't, probably because it wasn't politically correct, but this was a big thing at the time, especially amongst hardcores. Speaking of this, everyone was like, "Oh, it's like the Black Fedor," and like that's why we got excited. Like that's why I loved him. I'm like, yes, he's back and in a different form. Because Verdum, knocked out Fedor, and you've got this Cormier guy coming up. I'm like, he's the new hope. This is the guy. It's our guy.
Amazing. Black Fedor. I had totally forgotten about that. We did call him that. We probably shouldn't have done that.
No, that's probably why it died out, in fact. So I feel bad bringing that up. Of course, I bringing it up out of love and within context here. Another honorable mention is Nick Diaz versus KJ Nunes 2. I think is a hardcore fight fans. Again, this is an Elite XC storyline, of course, so you have to be a hardcore to follow that. That was the epic scene, if you see Nick Diaz in the highlight videos, where he's cut and he's flipping off the cage, he's mad at a decision, and he's walking up the ramp. That was Nick Diaz versus KJ Nunes 1. And number 2 was just a technical, boxing affair. It was a great boxing match if you love boxing and MMA.
Masterpiece, it really was, and that was a heated rivalry, man. I mean, KJ Nunes is kind of a name that went on to be a little bit forgotten with time, but at that time, man, as you said, he was kind of a guy that was being pushed and had the look and had the skills, and man, that was a phenomenal fight. That really was a good one, and I thought about that as well. I didn't want to have too much Nick Diaz on there, because man, how many Nick Diaz fights could you have on there? So I kind of in my head. That's really the only reason that one didn't make me, because that was such a phenomenal fight. But I didn't want to have too much Nick Diaz, and you have to go Diaz Daly is the best of those. But Diaz Nunes deserves some love. That's a good shot on the honorable mentions.
And you're right. Good looking cat, that KJ Nunes. I mean, he represented my people well. He was like the Keanu Reeves of mixed guys coming off the island and making waves on the mainstream. So you don't blame Coker for trying to Aaron Pico and get behind him at a young age at all. Like you could see the formula.
What's crazy? I was pulled up his record. Like I hadn't thought about. I'm trying to remember the fights and listen to this run that Nunes won, because he had a great record, and then his record went downhill fast. But listen to this run. He goes 1-5 in 6 fights. So you go, oh man, that's not too good. It's against Nick Diaz, Jorge Masvidal, picks up a win over Billy Evangelista, then loses to Josh Thompson, Ryan Couture, and Cowboy Cerrone. Oh, by the way, all of them decisions. So he was never finished. I mean, the guy was tough, man. The guy had some skills, and it's a shame because that was a tough run for him, man. And because in my head I was like, man, he was never the same after that fight. But then I just pull up his record. I'm like, well, maybe he was the same, but look at who the hell he was fighting, man. That's tough.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, even the last fight on that list against Cowboy Cerrone, I went back to watch that a little bit ago before Cerrone's last fight, and it's actually a competitive fight until Cerrone takes over. This is Cerrone where he's learning how to wrestle. And takes that path. But in the first round, you see KJ Nunes doing things like time marching and using Cerrone's own tools against him, which you wouldn't see until Jorge Masvidal and later on in the career, until guys started finally figuring him out. I do wonder if some of those people went back to watch that first round, because KJ made a good account for himself. And within the context that you laid, that's pretty crazy. I forgot about that, John. Before we get out of here, I'm just going to list some of the honorable mentions, the rest on my list here, before we get out of here, and feel free to interrupt and comment as you will. We mentioned Fedor, of course, even though it's not a fight that would earn any historical importance, but man, was that Brett Rogers fight fun to watch him come back from the busted nose. And that was a fight you could play casuals and go, and go, guess who's going to win this fight? And everybody's going to go, Rogers, Rogers, Rogers. And you press play and you watch their emotions do this.
What a story Brett Rogers was. I mean, an uplifting story to start his career, and not so great at the end of it, Wow. Yeah, Brett Rogers' name I hadn't thought about in a while.
I wanted to give some Jake Shields love, but the only fights that really that were my favorites, of course, was Dan Henderson, and then the forgotten fight against Jason Miller that ends with Jason Miller with an RNC locked in on his back as time running out. If there was just 5 seconds more, that's one of those fights where, I don't think the fighter was saying that to be harsh. That's true. Could have gone a different way.
Shields is tough, man, because he's so good, but his fighting style just clearly wasn't fan-friendly. It wasn't really exciting. But damn, I mean, it was hard for anybody to look good against him. I mean, much less beat him. He was a tough out. But even if you beat him, I mean, just to try and look good, his style, man, you can't, again, talk about Strikeforce without talking about Jake Shields. The dude's grappling is incredible, and it's just – his name won't be remembered, I think, as one of the greats necessarily, just because his style didn't necessarily lend to being, real fan friendly.
Which is crazy because you'll hear from guys like GSP and so on saying he was one of the most difficult guys even on the feet. Not because he was anything flashy or a knockout artist by any means, but he was just so awkward and tough. So, which kind of
Did you ever wonder how the hell him and the Diaz brothers hooked up? That just never seemed like a friendship that made sense to me.
No.
Like, they are so opposite in personalities, man. I just really wondered what those sessions went like, and just hanging out. Like, I wish I could have been a fly on the wall and seen some of them just chilling in the gym, because they seem like such different human beings.
It does, but Jake Shields has this weird kind of. I'm trying to put this in a kind way because I'm not trying to come out. I like Jake Shields, but he kind of has this offness. He has this offness about him where, like, if you watch him, whether he's walking to the cage or like just at a show, like he looks like he's perpetually lost all the time. Like he doesn't know where he's at. Like that's the best way to describe. You know what I'm talking about, John?
That's funny. I do. I know exactly what you're talking. And I love Jake, man. I saw him at the Quintet. When he had the unfortunate. Incident with Cub Swanson where it wasn't anything that he did wrong, but of course that's where Cub's knee damage came from. But yeah, man, I love Jake, but that's a funny observation, man. He's an interesting character.
But I think it's just because he's such a go with the flow guy. We kind of touched on this, a big historical fight, but didn't make the list because it's pretty one-sided, one-way traffic, which was Gina Carano versus Chris Cyborg, but deserves to be mentioned, of course.
Definitely a piece of history, man. You have to mention that. I mean, that was an iconic moment. But you're right. It's it was pretty much one-way traffic, and so it's tough to make a list, but definitely deserves to be mentioned.
Two good fights that were just good fights that could have made the list for that, but they're both Nate Marquardt's dealings with the Strikeforce title when he made his 170 drop, taking it from or beating Tyron Woodley for a vacant Strikeforce welterweight title, and then losing it in the defense to which is a trivia question that gets more popular given his trajectory, but the last welterweight champion, which is Tarek Saffiedine.
Yeah, what's funny is when you first mentioned the topic to me when we talked about doing the show, and obviously there's a lot to digest, but just immediately in my head I was like, okay, top 5 Strikeforce fights. The one that stood out like instantly that popped in my head was actually the Woodley win. I mean, that was just that finishing sequence is iconic. You know what I mean? That was an incredible moment. So I ended up not making my list because then when I really started digging through, I was like, oh wait a minute, now I remember. I forgot. Oh yeah, got it. But it was funny that when we talked about the topic, that was the fight that popped into my head right away.
Yep, it's a great fight. And then just some 5-round fights. Last 3 5-round fights that were just worth a mention. I think this was his coming out party, at least getting on my radar past his 10 Kennedy bookings, which was Luke Rockhold challenging and beating Ronaldo Souza in a 5-round fight. Of course, you also have Daniel Cormier with Josh Barnett. Don't need to say much there. That produced highlights of its own. And I never went back to watch this fight, John, but I did for this in this prep, and this was a 5-round fight. And you could tell that for obvious reasons they're building up Josh Thompson, but they didn't expect this guy Clay Guida to come in and give him such a tough fight. And that was fun to watch in retrospect.
Fight. Yeah, man, that's a classic fight, man. That's a little hidden gem there. People forget what Guida accomplished at Strikeforce, man. Yep. I mean, it's pretty incredible. So, yeah, man, that's a good moment. And yeah, Rockhold, got to mention Rockhold too, man. I know Rockhold is another guy that people like to hate on, but I'm telling you right now, Strikeforce era, Luke Rockhold especially, man, when he was making his way up, man, this dude was such a phenomenal athlete, man. And so obviously some things haven't gone his way in recent years. He's had some health troubles and all that, but I'm telling you, early on, and again, a homegrown talent that came through the Challenger Series. Big, strong, good-looking dude, very marketable, obviously, but the talent of the athleticism that you saw early on. And that Jacare fight, man, that's when we saw that, hey, man, this Surfer kid's the real deal. You know what I mean? He's actually, he's a well-rounded talent. But, I mean, dude, watching him develop was fun, man. That guy had clear skills and clear athletic talent. And
closing up this conversation, John, yeah, Strikeforce checked all those boxes, and following the Rockhold and many other storyline from that era of Strikeforce, the merger in the UFC, I think, kind of proved how well those, just like with the WEC fighters we saw that anybody discounting them, we're probably going to be on the wrong side of history. They did very well for themselves in the UFC.
Yeah, no doubt. I think they had to battle a little bit of stigma when they came in, but it didn't take very long. That went away. I mean, the same thing, like I said, with WC. It's like, they really belong here. Yeah, they really do belong here. And it's important, man. Just and we talk about history, and we talk about lessons, and we talk about, kind of understanding the sport. I think what Strikeforce and the WEC showed, and the lessons that fans can really learn from is listen, to me, and I believe this forever, and until things change, I'll always believe this. if you want to say that you are the number one fighter on the planet, you have to fight in the UFC because you have to be facing top contenders over and over. You have to be facing number 2 in the world, number 3 in the world, number 4. You have to. But to say that, a fighter that's on another roster isn't a world-class talent or isn't capable of accomplishing great things, I mean, just because somebody is fighting in an organization outside of the UFC, you can't write them off and say that, hey, they wouldn't perform here. There's no way they could keep up with the caliber of the UFC fighters. There's no way they could perform. Now, it's tough. I mean, it's tough to say you're the number one guy. I guess Fedor would probably be the last one because that was at a time when, the Pride's heavyweight divisions was actually better than the UFC's heavyweight division. I don't know that any organization could accomplish that now just because the UFC is such a behemoth. But it's just an important lesson. Look how great all these fighters did when they came over. And understand that when you're watching fighters on other rosters, they may not be the number one fighter on the planet, but that doesn't mean they don't have number one level talent and that they're not worth watching. So
Justin Gaethje.
I think that's valuable lessons. Justin Gaethje, damn right. There you go. Perfect example. Guy was having these wars in World Series of Fighting. I know hardcores like yourself and me we're telling people like, dude, this kid's fighting. Like, I don't care if you never watch another fight. You got to watch this guy. Bryce Mitchell, a guy that fought in World Series of Fighting. I was like, dude, this guy's got something, man. And so, yeah, you identify that you can be world-class talent in other organizations. You shouldn't be so quick to write people off. And organizations like Strikeforce and WC being folded into the UFC just proves it.
Well said, John. We got to get out of here, but so let's get on that note because I couldn't say it better myself. This was such a fun historical, historical time travel, if you will. Thank you for joining me again. Apologies, it's been long overdue, but this was everything I wanted from this, and I'm really glad how our list shaked out. Any last thoughts? And please plug your awesome show, the MMA Roadshow, which you can support on Patreon. Anything you want to plug before we get out of here, John, as well?
Yeah, I'll cut you some slack for not having me on earlier. Listen, man, we're both busy people. We got busy lives, but man, this quarantine and this furlough, that kind of changed the availability. We were trying to get this thing scheduled. I said, Dan, I got nothing going on, bro. I got absolutely – you just name the time, and I'll be there. I'm glad to do this. Hope we can do it again in the future. And, yeah, if people haven't heard, please check out the MMA Roadshow on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. We also have Patreon, patreon.com/the MMA Roadshow. That's where we do all the bonus editions, the and a half, if you will, post-fight content, and put a story there. I got a chance to speak to John Jones. He called me out of the blue, and I'm on furlough this week, so I couldn't do anything with it for Junkie. So I just said, well, let's just put it up there. So there's a great story. I think it was a good interview with John Jones that he reached out to me last night. So, check all that stuff out, and always appreciate the sport, man. I appreciate giving me the chance to talk about it. I know I ramble sometimes, but, dude, I love the sport. Any chance to talk MMA, dude, I'm down.
Man, that's huge. You taught me a lot, and whether I work with you or not, I'd go to bat for the work you do, John. Some of the best post-fight content, again, by the way, for the MMA Roadshow, as far as exclusive, because you guys are actually on site covering these things. You can't beat that. And again, just support. People complain. It's really easy to complain in our culture, right? But we see the analytics on what's being clicked on and what's being supported. And let's just say, folks, it's still a free world, and you can vote with your dollars. You can vote with your clicks on what you want to support. So support the good stuff out there. Support John. Support his show. If you want to support this show and help keep this thing afloat, free, and all that fun, you can go to mixedmartialanalyst.com. We got click-through banners for those of you Amazon shoppers. I know everyone's using that now on it, as well as a PayPal donation. And shouts to @AHBAI1986. 1 year off from being a great year, but still a good year nonetheless. Really appreciate that donation. Longtime follower and supporter of many good podcasts and programming. So again, thank you, John, for coming on. This was great. Thank you all for listening, whether you're on YouTube, hello, whether you're listening in the ears on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for your subscriptions, 5-star ratings, and reviews there. Stay healthy, and until next time, protect your neck.